Hi, this is Granny B of Granny B Crochets, and we're going to talk today about two things. One is counting rows, and the other is finding our gauge, because you have to be able to count rows in order to find your gauge. Now, some rows are really easy to count, like double crochet. Those are nice big stitches. It's pretty easy to figure out where your stitches are and how many rows. There's one, there's two. But when you're doing a single crochet, they're very tiny, and it can be a little confusing as to how many stitches are actually there. So what you need to do is kind of stretch it a little bit so you can see through it. And what we're going to do, so if you see the stitch, on either side of the stitch is a hole. So then rather than trying to count the stitches, count the holes. Now, we're not going to count this one all the way at the bottom. That's the chain. And as you see, the stitches go into the chain. We're going to start right above that where you have a full stitch. And you're literally going to count the holes. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and then up here at the top of your little V-zar, that's 16. So this piece has 16 rows. But sometimes you don't want to know how many rows are in the piece. You want to know how many rows are in the color. In order to do that, you've got to remember the color is the stitch itself, not what it's going into. So we're going to start this color right here on either side of the blue stitch. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Now that's pink, so we're not going to count that. We're going to stop right here. We have 7 rows of blue in this piece. Even though you're counting, it can get a little scary. Did I really count enough? Did I count the right? Was it really 16 or was it only 15 or was it 17? Let me give you a little hint. This is a piece and it is 1 row of single crochets. So I just made a chain. I turned around and I crocheted back. This is my working yarn, the long piece that's attached to the ball. And this is my beginning tail. And look at this. When I got done with the first row, my tail and my hook are on the same end, which means anytime your tail and your hook are on the same end, that's an odd numbered row. Tail and hook together, if you're right-handed and you've turned your work, here's your hook, there's your tail. You're getting ready to work an even row, which is row 2 in this case. If you're left-handed, be the same thing. Your hook and your tail are over here, and you're getting ready. You've done 1 row, an odd number. You're getting ready to start row 2. So anytime your beginning tail and your hook are on the same end, you have an odd number of rows on your piece. So if you get to the top and you're going, I think it's 16, you can look at that and go, it has to be an even number or it has to be an odd number, and then that'll help kind of verify that you've got it right. So if you're doing a half double crochet, it's the same idea. You just spread them apart, and again, you're just going to look for those holes and you're going to count the holes. Now, let me give you the reason I have this white thing ahead of me is one of the hardest things we have to do when we're crocheting is we've made something cute. So I've made this little play mat for my grandchild, and I've trimmed it with this black. But how do I count those rows? You can't hardly see them, so they're so dark. So you want something light behind them. And even my white board, as you can see, is not really light enough. So this one lights up. Look at that. Look how easy those holes are to count now. If you don't have a light up board, which most of us don't, hold it up to a window. You can just take it and hold it up to the window with the sun shining through, and you can just count your little holes to know how many rows you have. The reason I have a light box is I live in the basement. I don't live in the basement. I crochet in the basement, and I don't really have a place where I can hold it up to a window and count my rows. But you can see that light shining through. Each one of those holes is a row. And that's how you count your rows if you've got something really dark that you're working with. It's also helpful if you're crocheting in the dark. If you want to crochet a lot of black things, I recommend one of these, because you put it behind your work. It makes it a lot easier to see what you're doing. Okay, let's turn the light out on that, or down a little bit. Okay, now we're going to talk about gauge. There are 2 places you're going to find gauge. One of them is right on your ball of yarn. You have the wrapper on the yarn, and it has all kinds of information, tells you how much it weighs, how many yards there are. This one even shows you how much you need to knit those particular items. If you ever see something like this, typically they're knitting it. Crocheting takes a lot more yarn. But down under here are these little symbols, and these symbols tell you your gauge. The first one is if you're knitting. So it tells you if you use size US 8 or 5 millimeter knitting needles, and you make you make 18 stitches by 24 rows, it should be 4 inches by 4 inches. And over here for crocheting, if you have a USH or a 5 millimeter hook, and you do 13 single crochets and make 14 rows, it should be 4 inches by 4 inches. Now, most of the time you're not going to go by this gauge. What you're going to go by is your pattern. So you will have a pattern, and there's a gauge written on the pattern. And that's how you can figure out whether or not that sweater you want to make will fit, rather than waiting until you're completely finished and going, it's too small, or it keeps falling off my shoulders, it's so big. So what the person because we all crochet differently. Some of us crochet really tight, some crochet really loose. Girlfriend and I made turkeys together one Thanksgiving. Identical pattern, identical yarn, identical hook. Hers was twice as big as mine because I crochet very intensely tight. So in order to get my sweater to fit me when I'm done, I want to make sure I have my gauge right. And as you can see here, the gauge tells you 13 double crochets and 8 rows will equal 4 inches. And that is with the yarn and the hook they recommend. So this particular pattern is just calling for worsted weight or number 4 yarn, and it's calling for a size J or 6 millimeter hook. It's also calling for a smaller H. That's just for the trim. So the gauge is going to go with whatever hook you're using for the main part of the garment or sweater. Now, there are a lot of things where gauge doesn't matter. Most Afghans, gauge doesn't matter. Dishcloths, square items, even some purses and bags won't matter too much. But when you're making clothing, gauge is extremely important, because that sweater is not going to fit right if you don't have it to gauge. So how do I find out what my gauge is? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to crochet a square using the stitches that it says. So the gauge is going to be different for whatever garment. This particular one is just 13 double crochets by 8 rows. It's a very simple gauge because this is a very simple sweater. But I have another one that I made, and it had a lot of decorative pieces to it. It had fans, and it had chains, and so like one row would be really, really wide, and the next row would be really narrow because it was just chains and single crochets. And so that gauge told you how many fans and how many rows to get your 4 inches. And so in that case, when I made my gauge, I used the stitch from the pattern in order to fill my gauge. So sometimes it's going to give you information like this, and sometimes it'll tell you it's this many stitches and this many rows according to the pattern that you're making. So like if you're making V stitches, it might be a little different. And like I said, mine, it had some double crochet rows and some single crochet rows. So it's going to come out differently. So we're going to work with something simple. And so I made some gauges. So this is the first one. And I've been told a couple things. I have been told that you should make your gauge swatch bigger. Well, have a needle. Bigger than what it says. So we need a gauge swatch that, first of all, it's 8 or 13 stitches wide. So I just use yarn needles. They're my favorite thing to use. And I'm going to put one yarn needle in here, and then I'm going to count over stitches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. Okay, and then you're going to put a needle right there. Then you're going to take another needle, and you go just a little bit down from the top, right where a row is. So we're going to go right in here where this row ends. And you're going to do the exact same thing. You're going to go, only this time we're going to count rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, let me take a minute to double check that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right. Hold on just a minute. Let me pause you. Hi, I'm back. Forgot the most important part about checking your gauge. You're going to have something to measure with. So we're going with inches. Some patterns will give you centimeters. That's just on the other side of your measuring stick for most of us. So what you're going to do is you're going to put one side at 0 and the other side at the other needle, and it's 4 inches. So that's what we wanted. We wanted 13 stitches to be 4 inches wide. And then we're going to do the same thing going with the length. And so 0, and my length is just a little bit longer. Now, in this case, it's up to you how you need to adjust things. For me, a little bit longer is going to be okay because it's a sweater. So it's going to come out a little bit longer. My width is what's important, which are these stitches from here to here, because that's what's going to go around me. And what goes around me, that's what needs to fit right. So if I was making the sweater this direction, then this would be more important. And I might work a little harder to get this more accurately to 4 inches rather than 4 and a little bit. Now, this is the proper way to do a gauge swatch, by making it bigger than what it calls for and measuring out the stitches. This particular swatch, I used an I 5.5 hook, because when I used a J hook, I made this little swatch with my J hook first just to see how it would work. It came out way too big. It's 5 inches. That is not even going to begin to work. It's going to be a huge sweater if I go with that. So I went down and I got the smaller gauge. Now, this swatch here, thank you. This swatch here, I made it exactly 13 stitches wide and exactly 8 inches long, because I wanted to see if it made a difference of making the bigger swatch and measuring it, or just making one exactly to size. So I'll put my 0 here, and oh, it is a little bit wider. And let's go this way. Put my 0 there, and look how much longer it is. So you can see by just doing 5 by 5, my gauge is not the same. It's definitely showing that this is different. And what that is because you need the weight of the fabric and the other stitches to kind of stretch things or shrink things or whatever the case may be to get it more accurate. So it's actually kind of funny. These are 2 different size hooks and they came out the same size, even though one's a J and the other one was a I. So that's because that's why they recommend that you go with a bigger square and then measure inside the square, because it's going to give you a more accurate gauge of what you need, just because it allows things to shrink up and whatever the case may be. So you wouldn't think so, but clearly it made a difference in what I did. So always make your piece bigger than what you intended, and then measure the inside, and it's going to give you a more accurate representation of what your gauge is. Now that I know my gauge, I got my 4 inches, that's the hook size. Since this is the hook I used to make that gauge, this is the hook size I'm going to need to make that sweater if I want it to fit. Because if I go by the directions and use the J, it's going to be way too big for me. So that is why you need to know a gauge. So what's with the gauge on the package? Well, all this does is help you determine about what size yarn this is. So if I took my project and it's worsted weight, and then you make that gauge with a certain size hook, and I go over here and I see that, well, 13 single crochets, which is going to be tighter for me than 13 double crochets, comes out to 4 inches. That tells me this yarn is probably going to work. So if you're making a project and it calls for a specific type of yarn and you don't have that yarn, you can use this little gauge square to help you use a different one in the same pattern. So worsted weight yarns, you'd think, oh, it's a worsted weight yarn, it's a number 4 yarn, they should all be the same, but they're not. Let me tell you, this one is Big Twist. And it does for me when I crochet with it. It comes out pretty true to gauge for me. But if I use Simply Soft, I have to, if I want it to fit right, I have to use a bigger hook. But then my garment turns out really kind of almost sloppy looking. So what I do, because I call it a 3.5, because it's actually a very thin number 4. And if you like Super Saver, which is awesome for a lot of projects, it's what I call a thick number 4. It's almost 4.25, because it's just a little bit thicker than these yarns that I'm using here today. And that's just because the nature of the yarn, the people that make it, whatever the case may be. So basically what you're looking here for is just to help you substitute the yarns. Say, I want to make this sweater, but I love this other yarn. It's not the one it calls for. Is it going to work? This helps you kind of determine if you're in the right ballpark of what you're going to do. This called for an H. Most of your worsted weight yarns call for an H or an I. That sweater called for a J. That's not unusual. They're making sure it's just loose and a soft fabric, but it's close enough. Now, if this was like a 3-weight yarn, and I'm down here and I'm using a much smaller hook, like a 3.5 or a 4.0, that's not come close to my 6.0 the pattern called for. You're going to know that yarn is not going to work out right in that pattern. So this gauge here is just to help you compare the different worsted weight yarns, or the different worsted weight to, say, your DK or 3-weight, to make sure that it's going to work with the pattern you want to make. And so that way you can buy the right kind of yarn when you're substituting for what it's called for on the pattern. Because sometimes I live in a little town in Idaho. I can't always get all the fancy yarns that are called for on these patterns. Although it's much easier than my younger days, because you have the internet and you can order almost anything you want. But I do a lot of substituting because I prefer to shop local, and I'm kind of cheap. I don't use the expensive yarn. So if it calls for an expensive yarn, I'm out there going, all right, what can I use that's cheap in the same size range? Once you determine that it's close, then make sure you make that gauge, because if this yarn is just a little bit off from what they called for, then you're going to have to use the right hook in order to get your gauge correctly so it will fit what you are making. So that's the other reason, especially if you're substituting yarns, that you want to make sure you make this gauge so your sweater will fit. So once you've got your swatch made and you've measured it, what happens if it's not 4 inches by 4 inches? Well, you're going to have to change your hook size. So if you measured it and 13 stitches is bigger than 4 inches, you're going to use a smaller hook to shrink that down. So if you finish it and your 13 stitches is smaller than 4 inches, then you want to use a bigger hook to make it bigger. So smaller than 4 inches, bigger hook, bigger than 4 inches, smaller hook. All right, I hope I answered all your questions today. If not, feel free to leave me a comment. I hope you subscribe. In the meantime, it's been fun sharing some hints and tips with you. Happy crocheting, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.